Hi, Maxim. Maxim. Edward. Denise, would you like to start?
Just a second. Yep. I guess we're good to go. This time we have a briefer section, but still we have to stick to our schedule. And I want to apologize in advance. I was explicitly instructed to make us follow our schedule and the timetable. So a couple of minutes before the end of these 20 minutes, I'll write a brief note through the chat. And then we'll have plenty of time for discussion, which is probably no less important than the talks themselves. Our first speaker is Maxim D. Schreier. He is a professor of Russian, English, and Jewish studies at Boston College, and the author of 15 books in English and Russian, among them Living Russia, A Jewish Story, Voices of Jewish Russian Literature, Yom Kippur in Amsterdam, and most recently, Of Politics and Pandemics, Songs of a Russian Immigrant. And in brackets, I just can say that it seems to me introducing Maxim Schreier is anyways superfluous because he's so central to the field of the Russian Jewish studies that. But anyway, this was the introduction. Maxim, please. Maxim?
Yes, I'm here. I'm just sharing the screen. Bear with it. And it's going to take a second. All right. So, shalom, good afternoon. Dobry dzień. Can you all hear me? Can you see the pictures? Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
It's a real pleasure to be here, to see so many friends and colleagues. The title of my talk is Paths of the Russian Avant-Garde Poetry in Israel. On the title slide, on your left, you see the title page of Mikhail Grobman's collection, Military Notebooks from 1992, autographed to yours truly. And on your right, a hand-drawn title page of Ilya Bakstein's collection, Glints of the Wave from 1986, espousing very different styles and poetics. Both Grobman and Bakstein gravitate to visual images of wondrous monsters so as to signal the avant-gardism of their verses. And just, I guess, to amuse myself and all of you, I placed in the middle this beautiful drawing by Valentina Kropivnitskaya, a major artist in her own right and the wife of Oskar Rabin, a prominent figure of the second Russian avant-garde who emigrated to France in 1978. In a sense, the title slide is meant to underscore tentatively the idea of avant-garde Russian poetry in Israel as part of the larger transnational Russian cultural avant-garde. For the purposes of this conversation, I propose to understand avant-garde poetry as poetic creation that is formally, texturally or gesturally experimental, radical, or polemical vis-a-vis the poetic mainstream that precedes or surrounds it, and also as poetic practice that may be accompanied or augmented by public acts of protest, challenge, or defiance on the part of the creators of avant-garde poetic texts. What is being protested, challenged, or defied can only be determined contextually, measured against the axes of national cultures, histories, and politics, and conceptualized through languages and styles employed in the practice of avant-garde creation. Allow me also to make 4 preparatory observations, actually make 1 observation, pose 2 questions, and then make another brief observation. The first observation is that Zionism and avant-garde poetry make strange bedfellows. While some fascinating research has been undertaken regarding the confluence of Zionist ideology and avant-garde arts and letters, notably, of course, Michael Stanislavski's work on Zionism and Fin de siècle, it does not translate easily or comfortably into a generalized approach going beyond the boundaries of time, place, and language culture. Specifically, the history of Russian language poetry yields major articulators and propagators of early Zionism, be it political or cultural. Think, for instance, of Samuel Marshak's early Zionist verse. Think even harder of Zhabotinsky's poetry. And yet, both Zhabotinsky of his Hesped in the memory of Herzl from 1904 and Marshak of his cycle Palestine from 1916 gravitate toward classical versification and a case for considering this exemplary Russian Zionist poetry as avant-garde by virtue of its articulate message or outlying context is difficult, very, very difficult to make. In this sense, such blazingly experimental Judeo-centric and, one might add, culturally Zionist poetry as what Valentin Parnakh or Matvey Roizman were writing in the early 1920s Soviet Union are by and large exceptions and deserve more attention by the students of Jewish letters. Finally, I should probably mention in passing that modern Israeli poetry inherited a large dose of avant-gardism from the generation of Abraham Shlonsky, Natan Alterman, and Leah Goldberg, who had moved to the Mandate from the former Russian Empire and who were, to think of a term the formalists might deploy, nephews and nieces, or perhaps grandnephews and grandnieces of the Russian Silver Age. This backdrop for the understanding of the paths of the Russian avant-garde in Israel is significant, although I will not be able to do it justice in these brief remarks. Now, to turn to the questions I will investigate in the main part of the talk. The first is, how do we examine Russian Israeli avant-garde poetry against the backdrop of late Soviet poetry, third wave Russian emigre poetry, fourth wave Russian emigre poetry, and post-Soviet poetry? The second is, how do we measure the texture of Russian Israeli avant-garde poetry within and without the Israeli context? To turn to the next two slides. In the first, you see two images, both from the 1970s. On the right, you see a refusnik protest outside the USSR Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Moscow. Is it possible, is it not blasphemous to think of this refusnik protest as an act of heroic Zionist political avant-gardism? Think particularly of the slogan, visas в Израиль вместо тюрем, visas to Israel instead of prisons. On the left, you see a bohemian crowd congregating outside the legendary Saigon Cafe, corner of Nevsky and Vladimirsky Prospect in Leningrad. There is hardly any overlap between the people participating in the refusnik demonstration with the avant-garde protest slogan and the crowd hanging both outside and inside the officially tolerated gathering spot for nonconformist artists, poets, and their admirers. In the next slide, you see a line outside the Israeli consulate in Moscow. This is August 1990. And people from all walks of life mix and mingle here, all of them intent on getting out of the Soviet Union. This crowd is likely to include members of the artistic intelligentsia who were previously disinclined to emigrate and might have been given to private artistic pursuits, including those in the avant-garde unofficial circles. In the 1990s, largely due to the great influx of hundreds of thousands of Jews and their family members from the former USSR, one observes a major diversification and transformation of Russian Israeli culture. And one of the features of this transformation is what one might call the simultaneous mainstreaming and side streaming of Russian Israeli avant-garde poetry in the 1990s. In the remaining time, I would like to feature the profiles of 7 creative personae: Mikhail Grobman, Ilya Bakstein, Andrei Volokhonsky, Mikhail Gendilev, Gali Dana Zinger, Alexander Barash, and Anna Gorenka. Collectively, they represent 3 generations and 2 aliyahs. Their composite image tells a compelling story of Russian Israeli avant-garde poetry from the early 1970s to the early 2000s, where I will reluctantly have to stop. So the first brief segment is titled Mikhail Grobman in the Direction of Tel Aviv Conceptualism. Grobman, who was born in 1939 in Moscow and has been in Israel since 1971, was a prominent player on the nonconformist artistic scene in Moscow of the 1960s. In fact, he allegedly coined the term second avant-garde. Grobman is not only a visual artist, but a poet. While his visual art bears overt avant-garde formal qualities, Grobman's poetry is hardly experimental or texturally avant-garde. As a poet, he mainly clings to traditional classical versification and employs multiple ironies. His poetry brings to mind the work of the Leonozova circle, especially its master, Evgeny Kropivnitsky, also Yan Satunovsky and Igor Kholin, whose political subversiveness Grobman brings to Israel and deploys in his verses. Let's just briefly consider this beginning of the untitled poem Prativne Gory Samarii, which I will read in the English translation by the late Andrew von Hendy and myself. Samaria's hills are gross, you heard me. The clouds so grim, you wouldn't believe. Thus at Ovir, they all assured me, refused to let the damn fool leave. Why ruin your career, you weasel? Major Petryuk conveyed his doubt that Zionism spreads like measles. Even back then, he'd figured out. Here and elsewhere, Grobman the poet develops a poetics that runs parallel to that of Moscow conceptualism, finding the most common ground, I believe, with Dmitry Alexandrovich Prigov. In the context of Russian-Israeli literature, could the message of this texturally plain poem, the message that subverts from within and from without both the Soviet anti-Zionist rhetoric and the rhetorical justification of Aliyah, be considered an act of avant-gardism? I leave you with the question and move to one of my personal favorites, the late Ilya Bachstein, who was born in Moscow in 1937, made Aliyah in 1972 and died in Yafo in 1999. And this segment is called Ilya Bachstein Toward a Kabbalistic Transcends. A hermit by choice and by destiny, a true Buditlianin of Russian-Israeli poetry, Bachstein came to Israel with a poetic voice of his own, formed more or less in isolation and further forged during his Gulag sentence for openly challenging the Soviet system to permit its poets what the Constitution guaranteed every Soviet citizen. In Israel, Bachstein produced a peerless body of verse, originally published as an illuminated manuscript in the 1970s and 80s. And that, I think, is already an act of avant-garde desperate freedom. Consider, I just want to show you what it looks like in its illuminated form, and we will consider just the opening of this Афанта Ютома, also known as Fantasia Judaica. Я еврей, ни Мадонной рожден, ни к кресту пригвожден, и тоски мне не выразить всей цепи рода на мне, скорбь народа во мне, я застыл у безмолвных дверей. Bachstein is one of the few post-war heirs to Khlebnikovian transcends, perhaps the only one in Russian-Israeli poetry in both of its principal dimensions: paronomastic verbal meaning beyond conventional usage and cosmological meaning beyond traditional cosmology. I will now turn to the third segment, Andrei Volokhonsky, Paths of Absurdist Lyric. Born in 1936 in Leningrad, Volokhonsky made Aliyah in 1973 and lived in Israel until 1985. He subsequently lived in Germany, where he died in 2017. Different currents of absurdism nurtured his creativity, from poets of the Abiriu circle, especially Zabolotsky's nature philosophical verses, to Western modernists bent on absurdism, such as, for instance, Christian Morgenstern. We shall briefly turn to the example from Volokhonsky's Galilee, a song, and read the two opening quatrains. Пою на флейте галилейской лютни, про озеро, похожее на скрипку, и в струнах голос друга или рыбы. Да озеро, похожее на птицу, о, озеро, похожее на цитру. Над небесами, где летает небо, там голубая рыба или птица. На берегах, мой друг, до ныне не был. Volokhonsky gave Russian-Israeli literature a body of lyrics deeply rooted in place, Israel old and new, gently exploring the boundaries of Judaic and Christian literary identities and ecstatically celebrating Jewish poetics as a kind of tug-of-war game between harmonizing and disharmonizing messages about history. The fourth segment deals with Mikhail Gendelev, of whom we've heard a lot today from Masha Aptekman and from other contributors. So this will be very, very brief, but you cannot possibly omit this from the whole story. The segment is called Mikhail Gendelev, A Journey Back to Futurism and Constructivism. Gendelev, who was born in 1950 in Leningrad, came to Israel in 1977 at the peak of the first Great Soviet exodus and passed away in Tel Aviv in 2009. Gendelev's work has received much critical attention. And what I find particularly important in this context is the extent to which he fashioned and refashioned his public images. And yet, some of his most iconic public self-presentations invite a comparison with the poets of Russian futurism and constructivism. These two photos, look at them. In the one on the left, Gendelev so strikingly resembles Mayakovsky of around 1920-21, and in the one on the right, so tremendously resembles Ilya Selvinsky of the 1940s. It is just uncanny, and I don't think it's just the self-presentation. It's the verse itself. Let's turn briefly to Billiard Yafo, billiards in Yafo, and what I want to say here is that Gendelev's verses betray both an egocentrism of graphic arrangement. Perhaps it's a kind of special revision of the Mayakovskian step-ladder verse of Soviet poetry, and a futurist and constructivist centrality of the poetic utterance as the structural unit of meaning. If we conduct, let's just read the opening section and then conduct a brief experiment. Был бинт, горизонт, на коем сукровица полоса, а день был как день, покойник с видом на небеса, на акваторию сирого порта, сети и тех пустей, мысль была о бессмертии того же сорта, что уловы сетей. Now, the experiment. As you can see, we have rearranged these verses into quatrains, and the resulting form would further augment Gendelev's affinity, particularly in this case with the poetry of Ilya Selvinsky of the late 1920s and early 30s. Consider the two opening quatrains of the lay of Ulyalayevщина. Телеграмма пришла в 2:10 ночи, ковровый тигр мерно зверел, когда турецких туфель подогрический почерк исчеркал его пустыню от стола до дверей, and so on and so forth. I think the point speaks for itself without further elaboration. Now, thinking of the longevity of Russian Soviet avant-garde poetic traditions and their transplantation onto the Israeli soil, we leave behind Gendelev and turn to this fifth segment devoted to Gali Dana Singer, who was born in 1962 in Leningrad and made Aliyah in 1988. And the segment is called Gali Dana Singer, Roads of Russian-Israeli Translingualism. Gali Dana Singer, poet, visual artist, translator, publisher, larger-than-life cultural figure, is almost synonymous with what I earlier called the process of simultaneous mainstreaming and side streaming of Russian-Israeli poetic avant-garde. Likewise, двоеточие, colon, its title referring to a punctuation sign, not to a part of the digestive tract, the magazine of experimental arts and letters that she publishes with her husband, the writer Nikoda Zinger, is a window onto both the Israeli and the international Russophone avant-garde. The aspect of Gali Dana's avant-garde poetics that interests me especially is her exploration of various possibilities of translingual texture of verse. And I don't just mean merely bilingual or multilingual, but that lives and breathes betwixt and between, to borrow from the starkly monolingual Robert Frost. So let's take the example of this opening part into the muzzle of death, Merd, from part of Who. В морду смерти, Мерд, смерти в харю, мавет хара, хара мавет, тоже мне хмата хари, вейскадаш искадал, искадал вейскадаш, изгадил, Китишград с лица земли, изгладил, морду смерти как дашь, морду смерти как дашь. So what I find very interesting here is that both poles of paranomasia, if you think of Omri Ranan's theory, are at work here. The kind of explosive Khlebnikovian one and the punsteristic Nabokovian one, both are at work. Of course, the lion in Hebrew, Hara Mavet, which is a play on the Russian Smerti Vcharu, into the muzzle of death, could be translated as shit death or shit comma death. Notably, here, Zinger writes Hebrew words and expressions in correct Russian transliteration, as though read from the right to the left, and as if they were Hebrew transliterations of invented Russian words and expressions, as though read from left to right. And I think finally, Zinger's translingual Hara Mavet is probably, I suspect, a reference to Hara Mavet, the title of the 1979 collection of poetry by Aaron Shabtai. And on this note of traversing, and Denise, I'm getting there, very close. On this note of traversing the conventional language boundaries of Russian and Hebrew language Israeli verse, I'd like to move to the sixth segment, there are 7 altogether, which is devoted to the poetic practices of Alexander Barash, who was born in Moscow in 1960, came to Israel in 1989, and who has really made a huge name for himself, not only as a poet, but as Yehuda Amichai's principal Russian translator. And the segment is called Alexander Barash, In Search of the Mediterranean Note. I turn to the second section of Barash's poem, Time of the Third Rains, which on its surface is a fine example of Russian free verse endowed with subtle verbal orchestration and with a richness of Judaic spiritual and cultural references. Barash, so let's just read this section. Еще одно утро в квартире, висящей над Эйн-Керемом в Палестине 2 времени года, дождливая осень и сухое лето, различаются 3 периода ранних дождей, первые дожди, вторые и третьи. Сегодня 10-е, Кислево, время третьих дождей. Скоро придется закрывать окна от западного ветра, включать камины, забиваться в аквариумы автобусных остановок, как по соседству. Barash's poetry, of course, invites a serious scrutiny of the notion of the Mediterranean note, which the critic Alexander Goldstein advanced in the 1990s, and we'll hear about it soon from the next presenter, and which Barash embodies perhaps most fully. And it is perhaps fitting to end this brief inquiry with a discussion, perhaps an homage to a discussion of the short life of Anna Gorenka, who was born on the Karpa in 1972 in Bindere, Moldova, Tigina, if you remember the Romanian title, and which is now oddly in the unrecognized Pridnestrovyan Republic, who made Aliyah in 1989 and who died of a drug overdose in Tel Aviv in 1999. So this is called Anna Gorenka, Silan's Way. By the way, if we take seriously the pen name, it should be pronounced Gorenka, but I hear that other people pronounce it Garenka, so I'm not prepared to debate it. I'm only saying that the very act of adopting as her pen name of Anna Akhmatova's birth name, Gorenka, could be conceived of as a Jewish avant-garde gesture of defiance and of identity remaking. I would like to look very briefly, just to show you perhaps a couple of my very favorite poems by Gorenka, both of which strike me as being in conversation with Paul Celan, whose birthplace, Chernovitz, like Gorenka's Bindere, was under Romanian occupation during World War II and the Shoah. Like many of Celan's poems, Gorenka's poems enact a Jewish poet's agony over being verbally alive in a non-Jewish language in the post-Shoah period, in her case, writing in a slightly foreign Russian while living in Israel. And I'll just read this section. Wake up, all the poets, all died overnight in the hospital basement. They fill 3 big shelves. Some are swollen up horribly. Others have shriveled up, and one stinks so much, even the orderlies drop hints to each other about it. This last poem, which is called Translating from the European, has at the bottom of the poem in italics, the place, Theresienstadt, and the date, April 1943. Why Terezin? Why April 1943? Different possibilities come to mind. Perhaps this is because a transport of Jews from Westerbork arrived at Terezin in April 1943. Or is it perhaps a reference to the transport of children from the Bialystok ghetto that arrived in Terezin in August 1943? They would all perish in Auschwitz. There is in the last quatrain a reference to Warsaw as well. I think Gorenka's poems are laden with the verbal adoration of the imminence of death. I'm going to stop here, but before I do that, I just want to say that this is only a very, very partial list of names of Russian Israeli poets whom I have not been able to discuss today, names without whom a survey of avant-garde poetic practices in Israel would be forever incomplete. Savery Greenberg, Vladimir Tarasov, Petya Ptach, Arya Rotman, Mikhail Korol, Evgeny Soshkin, Denis Sobolev, and Asa Engele. In closing, I cannot but make the necessary if obvious point, namely that Russian Israeli poetry today is a mirror of Russophone extraterritorial poetry, and only the future will show which paths of the Russian avant-garde this poetry will continue to follow in Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maxim, for this amazing talk. I guess all of us have questions, including myself, but we'll have to wait for the time for the questions after the second talk. And our second talk, yeah, I see the, yeah, oh, okay. And our second talk is by Edward Weisbaum. Edward Weisbaum graduated from the Department of Russian in East European Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. After receiving his PhD, he conducted his postdoctoral research at the University of Toronto. Then Dr. Weisbaum returned to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem as a Lady David Fellow. He likewise taught at the Department of Russian and East European Studies. Nowadays, he teaches in the Department of Philology at the National Research University High School of Economics in St. Petersburg. In brackets, I can add that this is what is usually goes as in Russian as Vishka. Dr. Weisbaum's research interests encompass several fields: Russian and European modernism, Russian-Polish-Jewish nexus, Russian-Ukrainian literary relations, Russian-Israeli literature, culture and identity, including the context of diaspora and exile, post-colonial studies, nationalism, and minority studies. Eduard, please.
Thank you, Denise. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Great, thank you. I am sharing my PowerPoint. Yeah. Okay. In the last half of the 20th century, the notion of the Levantine outgrew its initial geocultural designation and became an important postmodern concept. The term the Levant overlaps with the designation the Mediterranean, but geographically and conceptually, the two are not identical. Associated with the former Eastern colonial territories of the Mediterranean region, the Levant acquired its initial cultural connotation in the colonial context. Terming local colonial representatives who adopted European culture as Levantines, Europeans attached a pejorative meaning to the term. They used it to label bearers of mixed cultural identities whose Europeanism was unstable and hardly concealed their non-European essence under acute Western eyes. In the post-colonial era, this stratified hybrid Levantine identity has undergone a cardinal axiological re-evaluation, most prominently in the work of an Egyptian-born Israeli writer, Jacqueline Kahana. Levantinism has now come to designate a transnational alternative to a separatist vision of an ethnic, political, and cultural map of the Middle East. In my talk, I shall explore an under-researched segment of the multicultural discussion on the Levantine, namely the ambiguous contribution of Russian-Israeli literature to this discourse. My talk deals with the literary heritage of Alexander Goldstein, specifically in the context of his role as one of the initiators of a Russian language literary project in Israel called the Mediterranean Note, or the Kavafi Choice. One of Goldstein's most important contributions to literary theory and the history of ideas was his elaboration of the Russian-Israeli Levantine literary idea and an attempt to embody it in his writing. In my talk, I shall explore the ambiguity inherent in the Mediterranean Note. Goldstein proclaimed the Levantine idea as a new perspective, enabling the works of immigrant Israelis writing in Russian to become an integral part of the Mediterranean cultural ecumeny. At the same time, Goldstein harbored an Orientalist attitude toward genuine Israeli Levantine reality, i.e., his approach was typical of the West's paternalistic view of the eastern region of the Mediterranean. In contradiction, this contradiction manifests itself in the ambivalent reception of his writing. Critics in Russia appraised Goldstein's writing as a unique manifestation of transnational Russian literature. Israeli critics, however, point to Goldstein's segregationist paternalism toward Israel. The one-sided approaches of Russophone and Hebrew-speaking critics give rise to descriptive and methodological challenges that impede a fuller understanding of Goldstein's work. To redress this imbalance, I shall analyze Goldstein's Levantine idea using research methodologies at the intersection of literary, cultural, and post-colonial studies. I posit the following claim. The Russian-Israeli Levantine idea was a concept designated to facilitate both literary self-fashioning and cultural absorption. Having mobilized the notion of the Levantine to valorize his position in broader Russian literary context, Goldstein did not pass its main test on post-Orientalist multiculturalism. Rather, he exploited the Levantine field of reference to consolidate his elitist Russian or Eurocentric cultural identity, while utilizing the Israeli context to uphold Russian colonialist views. The Russian-Israeli Levantine idea was, in addition, an attempt to overcome the externally imposed cultural isolation and the self-isolation of Russian-speaking intellectuals in an Israeli cultural landscape. Whereas Goldstein's appropriation of the idea of the Levant helped to revalorize his cultural self-image within the Russian literary context, he was much less successful in his integrative aspirations within Israel. Circulating exclusively among immigrants from the former Soviet Union, the Russian-Israeli Levantine idea, with its ostensible cosmopolitan perspective, clashed with the prevailing ethno-national segregationism of that milieu. The lack of acceptance by his Russian-Israeli audience was a major factor impelling Goldstein eventually to abandon his Levantine idea and to embrace Jewish ethno-nationalism as ostensibly a more effective form of cultural absorption into the Russian-Israeli and Israeli hegemonic mainstream. Indeed, Goldstein's newly adopted ethno-nationalist self-perception corresponded to the views of his Russian-speaking intellectual environment. Mainstream Israeli critics who had read Hebrew translations of some works of Goldstein in this vein, however, indignantly rebuffed his views. his writing readily accorded with the Israeli misperception of the so-called Russian street in Israel as extremely nationalist and right-wing. Alexander Goldstein was born in Tallinn, Estonia in 1957, but spent most of his formative years in Baku, the capital of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Azerbaijan, which became an independent country after the fall of the Soviet Union. In the wake of anti-Armenian riots in Baku in 1991, which the Jewish community apprehended as precursors of anti-Jewish riots, which in fact did not occur, Goldstein immigrated to Israel. In Israel, he engaged in low-paid writing for the Russian-Israeli press. His failure to study Hebrew for the most part precluded his joining the Israeli cultural scene. Goldstein swiftly conquered the Russian literary Olympus with his first book, Parting from Narcissus, Essays on Memorial Rhetoric, that was published in 1997. This book won both the prestigious Russian Little Booker Prize and anti-Booker prizes. Goldstein died of cancer in 2006. Parting from Narcissus contains Goldstein's essays that signaled a special momentum in Russian literary history, conveying an optimistic spirit of opening a window onto the wide world. Having bid farewell to the Soviet past, in the penultimate chapter of Parting from Narcissus, entitled Titus or Mediterranean Mail, Goldstein envisions a new stage of Russian literature endowed with a transnational diasporic potential, and he proclaims a new project, Mediterranean Note. At the end of the 19th century, the Austrian geologist Edward Swiss proposed the name Titus, the Greek goddess of the sea, to designate a primordial ocean that was located between the Eurasian and African continents 1 billion years ago. Relics of this ocean form the Mediterranean, Black, and Caspian seas. Titus, or Mediterranean Mail, therefore, immediately establishes the transnational perspective, the common archaeological origin of the vast region, extending modern geographical, national, political, and cultural borders. Titus, or Mediterranean Mail, is written as a realized prediction. Several parts of the chapter deal with conversations that Goldstein conducted while still in Baku with his imaginary older friend and ideal interlocutor, Sergei Melnikov. Their conversations serve as meta-poetic comments on the book. They speak about the demise of the Russian-Soviet epoch and the need to find new forms for Russian literature. At the same time, in view of Goldstein's imminent immigration to Israel, Melnikov speaks about the possibility of creating a Russian-Israeli Levantine literature. The Baku past alternates with the Tel Aviv present. In the latter, Goldstein, already in Israel, seemingly tests on the spot the possibility of creating Russian-Israeli Levantine literature, and literally creates it by his very text, continuing his imaginary conversation with Sergei Melnikov. Thus, in the Baku chapter, Melnikov predicts the creation of Russian-Israeli Levantine literature. I'm quoting. Sergei was referring to the idea whose advocates I then met in Israel, the creation of literature in the Russian language that belongs entirely to an alien, non-Russian geomythological world. Just think, Melnikov used to say, what a remarkable historical paradox it would promise us, the possibility of enclave Russian literature in the midst of the old, new Jewish Levant, literature written by stubborn immigrants from a literature-centric country, blazing up by its own homonym, by its perfect alienation and otherness. Russian literature would prove thereby the legitimacy of its maximalist claims. As Goldstein notes, the idea of an independent Russian-Israeli literature was widespread among Russian-Israeli writers of that time, like Gendelef. For them, this idea signified their exit from Russian literature and an attempt to present themselves as a part of Israeli literature. For Melnikov or Goldstein, however, such enclave literature is only a part of a literary historical association that ultimately culminates in expansionist claims on the part of Russian literature. I'm quoting, Russian literature would prove thereby the legitimacy of its maximalist claims. In his early writing in Israel, Goldstein constantly inscribes himself into the international literary field of reference. Even when writing about the possibility of Russian-Israeli literature, his examples are, for instance, Konstantin Kavafis's poetry, Lawrence Darrell's novel Justine, and Albert Camus' The Stranger. Despite his elaboration of the Levantine notion in Middle East cultures, which he buttresses with references to an international Mediterranean cohort, Goldstein's literary self-construction lacks native Israeli and Arab representatives. It signifies Goldstein's unequivocal alienation from the actual Middle Eastern cultural scene and his orientation towards the Russian readership. Thus, as I have said, the optimistic declaration of the Mediterranean Note marks an attempt to connect the new immigrants' integrative aspirations with literary agenda rooted in Russian literary imperial tradition. As Goldstein writes, I am quoting, Melnikov was seriously fascinated by the aforementioned Levantine literary idea from his own Russian point of view. Later, when there was easier access to texts, we agreed that the Russian word in the Holy Land would be better off spending less time circling around precious graves and sacred stones and hacking its way through to the Mediterranean Sea and the Levantine myth, to the salty, seaworthy metaphysics. It would be a realization of harbored traumatic intentions of our culture, yearning so long for the lost Hellenistic universality, the Alexandrian horizon. Goldstein echoes here Alexander Pushkin's description of the Russian Emperor Peter the Great, who chopped open a window to Europe. Whereas Peter the Great's window to Europe was northward, Goldstein offers an alternative, southward direction to Russian literary expansion. Having proclaimed the need for a literary colonization of the Levant with the help of Russian cultural concepts, Goldstein realizes it in the Tel Aviv sections of Thesis or Mediterranean Mail. I am quoting. It is a pity that Melnikov did not have a chance to glance at least fleetingly at this mixture of the Levantine Dickens, Hauff, and Aladdin, especially when the shopkeepers lay out carpets on the pavement and young Sephardi and Ashkenazi women pass by, graceful, stout, big-breasted, strong-legged Jewish women of the East and West with a distinct summery gaze, plump lips, and freshly laundered linen, with, despite their deodorants, and perfumes, such a stupefying smell of the natural body that it is better not to sniff them and not to look in that direction at all, if you don't have the good fortune to drag them immediately onto the sheets or to lie with them here right away on the Persian carpet near the eastern stall. Local women, like no other, I mean precisely local, not Russian, arouse scary, incessant desire, but it's damn subjective. Although Goldstein is sure that his desires are subjective, clearly they are built upon a widespread colonialist pattern of the Orientalization and feminization of the Orient, which has been discussed in Edward Said's book, Orientalism. Goldstein essentializes his desire as his subjective response to the inherent characteristics of the Levant. This self-indulgent description of the Israeli Levant exposes the economics of Goldstein's abortive desire. The more Goldstein feels his cultural alienation from these local, not Russian women, the greater is his scary, incessant desire for the feminized essence of the Levant. The Baku and Tel Aviv parts of Tissus or Mediterranean male thus create a diptych structure reflecting Goldstein's Russian colonialist vision of the Levant. In Baku, Melnikov projects his Russian colonialist vision on Israel or the Levant. In Tel Aviv, Goldstein embodies this vision in exotic and sexual stereotypes. As I have said in the beginning of my talk, Russian critics saw the project Mediterranean Note and the writings of Alexander Goldstein as the implementation of the transnational potential of Russian literature, despite the fact that his texts contradict key aspects of transnationalism or Levantinism that entail the rejection of a colonial relationship to the Orient and the need for equal dialogue with all its members. The constructivist perspective proposed in this talk, however, offers hope that integrative aspirations are not necessarily doomed to lapse into discourses of cultural imperialism or narrowly defined national identities. Recent developments in Russian-Israeli cultural life indicate the possibility of a meeting for integrative aspirations with current mainstream transnational tendencies in Israel and worldwide. Although these tendencies in Russian-Israeli cultural life may not necessarily engender valuable literary or artistic products, they nevertheless promote the de-ghettoization of the Russian-Israeli community and hopefully will contribute to a reconciliatory space for human solidarity and equality in Israel and in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edward, for this extremely informative talk. This is time time for questions to both our speakers. Questions, comments?
I just want to thank, I already thank Maxim personally, but I also want to thank him in front of everyone else, because I think that was an absolutely fascinating presentation that actually, especially in the United States, you know, there is not much research on it, and the Russian-Israeli avant-garde was extremely important. So I really want to thank you, Maxim, that you brought it up, and it was a fascinating talk.
If there are no other questions or no questions, I'm trying to check everybody. Yeah, it seems to me that there are no other questions in this case. It seems to me that I feel free to ask myself. I'm wondering, this is the question to Maxim, I'm wondering if this Israeli-Russian avant-garde, by mainstreaming itself, has established its own conventions and its own canon, because I'm just wondering. I mean, this is something that seems to me inevitable within the process of mainstreaming, and at the same time, these people are so different and so diverse with the, I'm not sure that there was a direct line of continuity between the main figures Maxim was talking about, and it seems, I'm just wondering how this entire picture represents itself for itself.
Thank you, Denise. I appreciate the question. And let me answer it in 3 different ways. First, I specified what I call simultaneous mainstreaming and side streaming. And I think the side streaming is just as important. And it's a process that is very different. And I kind of like the idea of the side streaming of Russian Israeli literature, and particularly of the avant-garde. 2, what I did here really differs radically from my previous practices as a historian of Jewish Russian literature. Years ago, when I was working on the 2-volume anthology of Jewish Russian literature, which has 2 centuries, about 135 authors, I have a section there which I have 2 sections that feature Russian Israeli writers, the earlier emigrations, and then the late Soviet Aliyah. And at the time, my approach was really historical. I did not ask myself the question, how do we read these texts on their own terms? I asked myself the questions, what is Jewish about them? How do they belong to the tradition? How is the canon emerging? The canon meant a lot more to me back then than, quite frankly, it means now. What I did this time was I had a certain story in mind, a certain map of, say, the last 40 years. And then when I looked at the individual writers who I thought were meeting various avant-garde criteria in the texts, in the public behaviors, in the gestural configurations of their works, I essentially told myself that I'm going to withdraw from everything I know about the Russian-Israeli context per se, and think of the texts and how they suggest an avant-garde poetics. So essentially, for instance, when I speak about Genderev and the futurist and constructivist traditions, that which I don't believe has been pointed out sufficiently, I'm simply acknowledging what I think the texts are aching to be acknowledged, but somehow people who think more about the canon are less interested. And that was really here the approach. I mean, look, not to wax poetic for a minute, when I was in 2nd year of doctoral studies, Robert Jackson was one of my mentors in the Chekhov seminar, told us basically, read every story as a story that suggests its own poetics, its own approach to reading. I really practiced that with each of these authors and each of these texts. And so what avant-garde poetics they suggest, I think they stand on the strength of the individual context of each author. Now, when we begin to embroider the larger story with these individual profiles, I think we learn a lot, but I hardly can speak comfortably about canon making at this point. And that's just an acknowledgement that, you know, the last 30 years, what I was doing has been partly for nothing, which I'm very sorry to say to you. Thank you.
Thank you. It was really a question. I didn't know. It seems to me it's kind of that I was wondering about without having an answer in my head and without having a preference for an existence of a canon or the lack of a canon. Just it was a question about a broader picture. More historical question, even more historical question than a textual question. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Denis. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. More questions, comments? In this case, it seems to me.
I'll just say one thing. I was waiting to say it before, and it's sort of, I didn't have room to get into it. But the question of Gendelev's anxiety having to do with Brodsky is peculiar, but I also think in part to answer this question properly is to acknowledge the extent to which Gendelev learned from Brodsky, but also learned negatively and positively. So the anxiety here is an anxiety of both influence and non-influence. I don't think he was that anxious about Brodsky's fame. To say that is honestly to say nothing about Gendelev's poetry. I think to get to where he is both avant-garde and traditional is to think about him in conversation on the one hand with Brodsky, who as a young poet very much learned from the same early Soviet poets that Gendelev was so often in conversation with. So that's just a caveat. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it seems to me this time our break will be relatively short. And
let's take 5 minutes break.
A 5 minutes break. I was thinking about 3 minutes. 5 minutes break, and we'll back at it's 1 hour more in Israel now, so it's we'll be back at 10 and 2.
Okay.